So let's do a final review of the information and how do we get to edit that information on the building elements before we export to IFC. So right here we have the final schedule, the information management IFC properties for walls, slabs, columns, and beams, and I have already populated most of the information needed. So note all the fields being filled up. Now, the nature of these three fields is such that they actually come from different sources. So not all of them can be manipulated in the same way. And of course, you should manipulate them directly into this schedule since this is listing directly the IFC p-sets that are assigned to the translator. So the question will be, where do we change the information from, if not from the schedule? And the answer to that really depends on the type of information. Program block, for instance, is a global parameter, and as such, it can be edited from a single field within project info. So whatever number you type in here now should be populated in all the fields where that parameter is used. So imagine we type in M9 and we click on OK. Then all those values in the schedule that are going through the ArchiCAD properties and then through the preview translator and then back into the pset parameter, they get transformed to M7. It is not the same with all the building elements. So let's adjust this column for now. Since the selection really depends on whether the elements are editable directly and where the information is coming from. So for the sake of classifications, for instance, you can actually classify them by the type if we are driving the types from the building materials, composites, and profiles. Such that once you select one row, you can go and click on select those elements, the IPE 300 on the 3D view, like so. And then upon selection, use the edit selection set, Control-Shift-T if needed, and then change the classification in bulk right here, just by selecting a new class. Let's click on cancel for now. Let's go back to the schedule. Another example of such a thing will be the type ID, which is connected to an ArchiCAD property that actually brings in the name of the building material, composite, or fill. So changing it directly here won't change the original source of information. Rather, this one is, unlike the others, driven not by a global value, not by a classification, but rather by an element parameter. This is the actual buildup or the structural buildup of the element. To edit the values directly, it's most common to use a similar schedule like this, but one that displays the ArchiCAD properties instead of the resulting mapped IFC properties. So let's go ahead and do that. And we just simply need to do a right click and click on new schedule so that we can duplicate the current schedule. So let's click on duplicate, change IFC for AC for ArchiCAD, and let's get rid of the suffix copy 1. And let's click on OK. Now, before we go ahead, I have also noticed, and probably you too, that we still have in here some remainings of the incoming IFCs. And those are the comparisons between the two structural IFCs, the old one and the new one. So we can get rid of that simply by adding a new criteria and using the layer or layer name. So let's say that we avoid all the layers that does not contain the words IFC. So includes everything else except for those containing .ifc, which are the new and old layers for those old and new pieces that we were comparing. Now, this schedule in particular is not meant to display these p-sets from the IFC instead of using the property sets. Let's remove that. And let's bring in the ArchiCAD properties. Now, you can have a combination of ArchiCAD properties and some of the other values, parameters, attributes, and so on. So let's add the ArchiCAD properties in this case. And as you recall, we've got them under its own group. So you can bring those in. But these will be a mapping item. So if you want to bring in the classification, you can do so through another manner. Let's, for now, check this set and click on OK. Now let's adjust these columns quickly. Like so. And now you'll see we have a cleaner view of those properties. Note that these values, although you can type in there, they're not available for you to change. And what that means is that if you type over this value, then the ArchiCAD property will be disconnected from the mat value and it will assume a custom value instead. Same thing for the block value, M9, or the type ID. So avoid typing in those values to prevent the ArchiCAD property from being disconnected from its expression, or the current expression we have. So how to manipulate these elements from here? Well, the default way of doing that is simply by doing a selection by the row and then clicking on selecting the elements in 3D where you can change them directly. Otherwise, we will then change entirely the shape of the schedule. And that can still be possible, just not all values will be able to be displayed. For instance, project info is not available from a schedule, but the type or composition is. And actually it is the same as the first column here. So you could, in theory, change it from here if you decide to do that. Notice that that's going to change the actual geometry of the element. So what will we do if we needed to change something like the classification system, for example? In that case, what you would like to do is to go to Scheme Settings, and then for now, just get rid of these three ArchiCAD properties and bring in the actual classification we use, which is Uniclass. Let's put that in there. And also the ArchiCAD classification. And what we'll do is organize this by the ArchiCAD class, which is driving the IFC class, then going into the specific type of element, and then its classification in the reference classification we're using, which is Uniclass. Let's click on OK. And once it's done, let's organize this, adjusting the width of the columns. And you'll see that this is the distribution that goes from the most generic things to the most specific things. So it's a good opportunity for us to use the headline. So let's use a headline on the actual type, something like that. And now you'll have a collection of all the beams, depending on the structural buildup of it, and then the actual class. And now you will see that you can effectively change the class from this schedule. So now you have available the same list you have elsewhere, including the edit selection set. Notice that there are other ways to check for values that are not necessarily looking at a schedule. You can use the 3D view and use what is called graphic overrides in order to check for missing parameters or missing classifications. The way we do that is by creating a new graphic override, which is down here in this button. And let's create a new one here from the left. And let's call that Uniclass 2015. And then check. And what we want to do is to create a couple of rules right here on the right-hand side. And those rules will check for every element and its Uniclass value. So let's click on Add New Rule down here. And this is going to be a completely new rule. So let's check, let's name it Uniclass. And let's click on these three buttons to edit the rule. Now, the rule uses a criteria similar to that one on the schedules or the one on Find and Select. And the way we're going to use this is by using all the 3D elements with an additional criteria of uniclass. And what we're checking for is that the uniclass has no value, meaning that the element doesn't have a classification under that classification system. And when that criteria is true, then we override the color. And let's say we're going to make it transparent. Let's say completely white. And let's say 50% transparent. So if the element is in 3D and is not classified under uniclass 2015, then it becomes transparent. Let's click on OK. And let's add another rule. So this one is going to be the default for what happens for those elements that are actually classified. So let's call it default green for uniclass, let's say. And in this case, it's going to be a similar one where all the 3D elements, now we don't need to check for anything because we're already excluding those that are classified, that are not classified. And then those elements, let's say we're going to turn them green. Let's say these green. And let's click on OK. Then let's apply that particular graphic override to this view, like so. So now you can see in the model, those elements that are transparent have no classification. Those that are green do have an actual classification in the uniclass 2015 system. Similarly, we could do another one. And we call it Zig properties. And let's add a new rule. And in that rule, we're going to check for all the parameters, all the properties at once. Now, you could just check one by one, which is probably advisable. But for the sake of time, let's add simply all those individual properties, archetype properties, to be populated at once. So we are only checking whether those archetype properties have value or not. So in this case, let's say if the value of the classification is not undefined, meaning it does have some kind of value, also if the block is not undefined and the type ID is not undefined, then it gives it, let's say in this case, a blue color, something like that. Let's click on OK. And now let's add the existing rule that makes things green. We could use a custom one, but we can reuse that one. Remember, this one is simply just making everything else green. Now let's click on OK. And now you'll see color-coded. Those elements with those Zigurat properties are turned blue, while the other ones do not have the values under those properties are turned green. Okay, let's reset this back. So let's click on no overrides and let's continue with the exercise by exporting our model to IFC.